Hi friends, and welcome to Marvelous Friends, your home for all things Marvel Cinematic Universe and beyond. I'm Rhett, and today I'm going to be reviewing Dark Phoenix with a 5 and 5. Roll that credit. I don't know where exactly I would place this on the list of my favorite X-Men movies overall. I was let down when I saw it. However, it was not as bad as I thought it was going to be based upon everything I heard going into it. Yet I still would place it above Apocalypse, which was not a great movie. And in fact, while I was scripting this video and this review, I was having a hard time, in fact, the exact opposite problem I was having with the in-game review. You see, with the in-game review, I was having a hard time finding things I didn't like about it, and I was just so jazzed and loved every single aspect of it. It was really pulling hairs to find things I was not necessarily 100% happy with when it came to in-game. With Dark Phoenix, it was the opposite problem. I was having a hard time finding things I actually did like and was overwhelmed with things I really was not a fan of. But I was able to scrape them together, and so I do have my top 5 favorites and top 5 least favorites. I will say right here, if you have not yet seen Dark Phoenix, go ahead and stop if you do not want spoilers, because there are going to be spoilers ahead. But with that said, let's jump into it. I'm going to start off with my 5 least favorite things, and then end on as a positive note as I can with my 5 favorites. Number 5, a repeat story. This critique seems quite obvious, but I was kind of found this to always be the root of a lot of the problems I found with the movie and kept coming back to this. X-Men's Last Stand came out just over a decade ago, and the retelling so soon kind of set this one up for failure. And I will say, I actually, looking back on it, enjoy Last Stand a lot more than Dark Phoenix. Yes, there are differences between the two stories. Some of these did kind of help this one and made it kind of more interesting. However, some of them honestly made it worse. One thing I think that would have helped this one, though, is to actually acknowledge the existence of the first film, kind of showing the inevitability of the Phoenix Force no matter what happens in the divergent timelines between the original trilogy and the First Class storyline that we have now. Again, this kind of just seemed like a lack of planning and a lack of good storytelling by Fox to fall back on the same story, and I think just doing something different to kind of end the X-Men would have been a lot better. However, I do understand this is an iconic story within X-Men, so it does make sense to use it for this, but I think it was done better the first time. Number 4, character diversity. Now, this is one thing I mentioned in my Everything You Need to Know leading up to the film's premiere early last week, and that is the fact that there's been a lot less characters in this first-class run of the storyline than there was in the original trilogy. Now, this has allowed us to care about the 6 core characters that we have in each of these films rather than the 12 to 15 we had in the original trilogy. However, this has left us with a much smaller scope and diversity of power sets and heroes, or villains, to go against Jean when she's fully supercharged by the Phoenix Force. However, we can clearly see in the Xavier's school that there is no lack of film extras in this movie. We see young kids, both very young to high school age, roaming around, and from the events in Apocalypse, we know that Xavier is not opposed to starting training very young. So it would have been nice to see some references to recognizable characters in this movie, kind of seeing those maybe younger aged versions of some of our more favorite later generation X-Men, and maybe even some of those training sequences involving some extra X-Men that are a little bit more disposable, but still a reference that we the fans can get. In addition to all the school children, we got a big load of Brotherhood characters from the place where Magneto is staying. Now, this is not named in the movie, but it's called Genosha, and I will touch on that later, as well as the Brotherhood, but the fact that we also, once again, got really nothing from this either really is disappointing. We did, of course, get Magneto and his +2 that were taken with him against the kind of final big battle against Jean. However, we still just didn't have all the characters. It was a letdown of just the scope that X-Men and its comics have to offer as far as characters go, to see only really about 10 characters featured within the movies. And I will add on to this that I was very disappointed not to see Jubilee back. She was very much so, I guess, a throwaway reference in the Apocalypse film to not have her come back as a bigger part in this film. But again, that's how they treated Dazzler in this movie, so I guess that's just what they do. Here's a random reference. We're going to give you one reference rule, non-used hero, and that's what you get. So that, again, disappointed that Jubilee wasn't back, and honestly, yes, her power set isn't necessarily spectacular, but Dazzler was just a throwaway for a kind of background scene within the movie. Number three, resolution. Or it's probably better to say lack thereof. The original trilogy did wrap up its story, kind of ending the franchise with really no future plan to move forward, just the probability of a few potential kind of spin off movies to follow suit, with kind of the idea of doing some origin films for the key characters, which we did end up getting Wolverine's origin story, and then that kind of steamrolled with Wolverine being so popular to give him another movie of his own, and then it was decided to restart. So, but all that happened, but basically the original X-Men trilogy ended itself kind of in a way that was fulfilling. This film does not do that at all. In fact, we are left wanting more and so many open stories left to tell after this one ends, which is stupid of Fox. Fox knew going into this that this was their final story. In fact, they reshot the ending because of issues and it being too similar to Endgame. And I will say that is kind of a it's unfair because Endgame came out and resolved the Marvel Universe so well, and this one just doesn't do it at all, and I think maybe some of those reshoots were the problem. There were so many times that we could have gotten a finalizing kind of end-all event in the final sequences of the movie, but every single time, Fox pulled back to stop it. The perfect example of this is when Jean is killing Volk, and it kind of starts getting out of hand, and some of the other X-Men start to kind of be dissolved away as well with Volk, and so Jean pulls back to save them. Well, they still live on, they still have stories to tell, and we get major cutscenes of all of these kind of continuations moving forward, and so there's just no resolution for any of the characters. We needed something much more finalization. We need more finalization in this film, and we just don't get it. I'm rattling on here. And in fact, it would have been enough to kind of show us that once Jean sacrificed herself and destroyed the Phoenix Force, that it was at least destroyed in the context of this story. However, in the last scene, when we see Charles and Magneto playing chess in the French cafe, which was a nice nod to the original trilogy, though them playing chess against each other was not really set up in this storyline at all. But it was a nice nod to the original trilogy and how they played chess a lot against each other in those first couple films. But in that scene, we see the Phoenix flying through the upper atmosphere, knowing that it's alive and that it will return, again, giving us more setups for future films that we will never get. And it just doesn't make sense to me why Fox left this so open and gave us no resolution to the story. Number two, Charles Xavier. Speaking of the Professor, why was he our secondary villain in this film? He was very much so painted by the other characters to being a bad guy, and his overall behavior in the film very much so lived up to that portrayal. Professor X has always been a very merciful leader of the X-Men, wanting peace and harmony between humans and mutants, never wanting to use force to get what he wants into that end goal. However, we find Charles in this film to be manipulative, egotistical, almost power hungry, and when it came to the moment when Raven or Mystique is killed, he seems very indifferent, cold, and as if he doesn't care. In fact, he stops the Beast from doing what is needed to prevent a kind of outburst by Jean Grey that ultimately led to her death, wanting to give Raven a chance, yes, to talk her down so that there wasn't any harm done, but then everything happened and he didn't seem to care that she died. He just kind of moved on as if it was another part of the mission, which all of this just seems very uncharacteristic to the Professor X we all know. And yes, we have kind of explored some darker aspects to the character back in the kind of scenes and the parts of the story where we watched him kind of go through the dealing of losing the use of his legs, and things like that can lead people to a darker, kind of more mentally disturbed place, and that was very on kind of topical and very truthful telling of that process. However, in that film, when the time come for him to do what was needed and to step up and be the leader of the X-Men, we saw him return to his true self, being a very, level-headed, very, I don't know what to say here, but just being the leader we know him to be. And so to see him in this way and portrayed in this way was almost unsettling to me as an audience member. Number one, Vuk. I bet you were wondering who that blonde woman named Vuk and her people were. In fact, you may not even realize that her name was Vuk. Am I right? Well, let's just make it clear. They are not squirrels. They are a completely different race of alien called Dabari, and the Dabari come from a planet called Dabari 4. Now, it is true Dabari 4 was destroyed by the Phoenix Force in the comics when it came in contact with each other. However, that is where the similarities between the comics and the film version ends. And the main point of that is because that's also where the information in the film ends as well. There is no kind of backstory or kind of introduction or kind of explanation who these aliens are, and the only one that we kind of get, and it's a very, very small one, is in the conversation between Vuk and Jean as she explains to her what the Phoenix Force is and how she knows about it, which again, this conversation is all done to kind of convince Jean to follow and give Vuk the power of the Phoenix Force, and so it's very manipulative and could be very misleading, so it has to be kind of one of those moments where we as an audience who have no other information either kind of don't necessarily trust what's going on and what's being said because we know her true motives. And on top of that, I have to also point out some serious kind of discrepancies here as well. Now, in the opening scene, we get a brief look at what the aliens look like, and it is relatively true to what they look like in the comics. I think they look really cool, but again, like I said, they are not Skrull in the comics. The characters that are part of this alien race do not have the ability to shapeshift. They are not bulletproof. They do not have telekinesis, which is somewhat led us to believe that Vuk does in some level. And also, they are not regenerative in nature. The only thing they get right is the fact that they do have an enhanced level of super strength, just in that of comparing them to humans, so they are kind of super strong, and we did see that kind of executed in the lackluster, in my opinion, train battle sequence. But other than that, they were kind of just left with a big question mark. Who is she? Who are these people? You know, what are all their motivations and stuff like that? And we just really don't get a lot of that kind of clarified, and so we're just left again with more unresolved questions that need further film explanation than what we're going to get. So that was my biggest issue with this film, is kind of how these aliens and her main bad guy was treated, and without any kind of explanation to them at all. Now onto my favorite aspects of the film, and some of these are stretching it, to be honest. Number 5, Cyclops. I didn't hate him in the film, and that's saying something for me. Often I find him in the movies and in the comics to be a whiny brat who is very unlikable. Often I find him to be, for lack of a better term, a douche who at the end of the day is only looking out for himself, and sometimes, Jean, being driven into fits of rage and jerk-like behavior when things don't go his way. Am I saying Scott, aka Cyclops, was my favorite character in the film? No. In fact, I don't think I have a favorite character from this film. That's troubling. However, I left the film not rolling my eyes and irritated at everything Scott did in the movie, which is saying something, because when I left Last Stand, I was so happy he got disintegrated by Jean, and actually going into this movie, I hoped he would see a similar fate. And I was happy he survived. And perhaps this is because I was so upset by the bad portrayal of Professor X that this kind of overshadowed how I normally feel about Scott. But either way, this is a marked improvement, so I'm landing this in at number 5. Number 4, it's over. I know this is somewhat spiteful to have this on my favorites list, but I'm happy to see this run come to an end, and so it's on the list. I will say that I did enjoy First Class. I thought it set up a potentially great storyline, seeing a much younger and more kind of introductory team of the X-Men. However, the following films didn't really set up to this kind of introductory and quickly jumped to our more standard list of characters almost as out of a crutch. Now, I get that a lot of the characters that we met in First Class were not necessarily your standard recognizable characters, but make people love them and they will follow suit. To kind of jump to these more recognizable characters just showed kind of a lack of planning and a lack of real creativity by Fox. And in fact, they made this worse by constantly kind of self-pointing out the fact that Wolverine wasn't there. If you had just established the fact that Wolverine isn't here because he doesn't join the X-Men until much later, like he did in the original trilogy, fans would have been fine with that. I think it would have left people wondering less where he is all the time if it had just been directly acknowledged that yes, he'll be here eventually, don't worry about it. Now, I'm just happy that we will get to see this kind of reintroduced, here in Phase 5 or 6 of the MCU, and I'm really excited to see what they're going to do with it. They have done a great job of kind of reintroducing characters to the MCU that necessarily haven't been treated the best up till then. I'm excited to see what characters they use. I'm excited to kind of just have them really take hold and use the X-Men to their full potential because I love the X-Men so much. So I'm ready for them to be done very, very well. Number 3, the Brotherhood. One thing I found missing so far in the X-Men franchise since First Class was the lack of backing that Magneto usually has. Typically, Magneto leads a group of mutants opposite that of Charles Xavier and the X-Men that kind of works as a direct opposition to them called the Brotherhood. Part of the lack of this group was because Magneto and Mystique, for that matter, were used kind of as anti-heroes in this storytelling, with both of them working as an extension and often fighting just alongside the X-Men when it came down to the main action of these movies. Now, I mentioned this in my least favorites, but we do also get to see Genosha in this film, so when we arrive in Genosha, we see it being led by Magneto, and I liked that this reference was here. For those who don't know, Genosha is kind of an island nation that is set up as a kind of sanctuary and community uh, for mutants to kind of go to and live on their own away from humans if they so choose. In this kind of telling, it is seen as a sanctuary set up by the US government and is being led by Magneto, which then kind of ipso facto makes them the Brotherhood, which is actually a very appropriate name for this grouping because we see that it is very much so a communal community. I won't call it a cult, but it is very much so kind of like cohabiting and working together to kind of create a successful community for everyone. Now, we also do get to see a couple of the Brotherhood members in action as he does take them with him to battle Jean. By IGN, this was kind of clarified and confirmed that this was Selene and Red Lotus from the comics. However, this isn't, again, acknowledged in the comic books. We don't really get any kind of information as to what these things are. They're just kind of passing references. So that is why I included them in my not-so-favorites as well, because there was kind of a lack of proper use of these, even though I did enjoy that they were included, even though not technically explained. Number 2, self-sacrifice. I did like how Fox decided to end the Phoenix in the film. And not to toot my own horn, I did predict it, which might mean that it was a little bit obvious, but I also feel that it was the best way to handle this, considering we didn't really have anyone that could match her power and the full extent of the Phoenix Force to kind of take her out. Again, I'm not a fan that we see that she lives at the very last scene. Again, we see the Phoenix Force flying through the upper atmosphere, but I did like the fact that she was kind of self-sacrificing to save everyone else. Again, this parallels Mystique and her self-sacrifice, knowing that it was very risky to approach Jean when the whole scene was going on, and that she, did truly what she was kind of known for in this franchise, which was being a really true friend, which is not Mystique's style normally in the comic books, but it was nice, again, to see that they kind of lived up to the Jennifer Lawrence version of this character and made her die doing really what the character has done well so far, and that's being a olive branch to mutants. Now, I would say, though, I would like to have seen more of this, not to be morbid, but since this was kind of a final franchise moment, I wanted to see a little bit more. Quicksilver, for example, really wasn't used after his injuries, so he could have been killed off right then. I thought Magneto was actually dead at the end of that scene, but then all of a sudden we see him alive and well and fighting against the enemy alongside the X-Men in the next scene without really any issue. Also, I'd like to have seen the bonfire kind of power explosion of Jean when she first loses control of the Phoenix Force to be a little bit more kind of earth-shattering rather than just a bruise on Scott's cheek. I just would like to see more. Again, this is a resolution film. It's an ending cap. I felt there should have been more ending to more of the characters. But for the characters that did die, I do say they were handled very well and done very well. So I did like that in the story. Number 1, self-control. Now this does kind of play into number 2 just slightly, but I thought it was a little bit different and a little bit more important, so I gave it the number 1 slot. In the film, there is a moment where we see Jean take full control of the immense power the Phoenix Force gives her. Now, there are moments, of course, when she first receives it that she struggles with it, and ultimately, in the end, she is losing control of it, so she makes the choice to implode it upon herself and Folk, saving the rest of the X-Men and the planet at large, I assume. However, there is a good substantial point in there in the main core climax of the movie where we see Jean using the Phoenix Force as a tool of her own will. In the original kind of trilogy, we see much more of a story where, yes, Jean does kind of seem to be in control, but it's much more the Phoenix Force using Jean as a tool in those instances. So I think they kind of gave us a moment here where we see Jean really take on the true nature of the Phoenix, which is something we do see in the comics and something we haven't seen in the film yet. For a good stint in the comics, Jean actually becomes known as the Phoenix and uses the Phoenix Force and its power to great means and under great self-control, though again in the comics eventually losing control of it and them having to kind of make that ultimate sacrifice and get rid of Jean and therefore the Phoenix Force. However, so anyways, back to this movie, I do like that we got to see that glimpse. Like I said, it was very short in the film, but it was nice to kind of see that represented, and it was a nice difference from the original storytelling that really was a great positive for this movie. The biggest issue here, and I know I said it, is that Dark Phoenix is suffering from comparison issues. Of course, it is being compared to the Last Stand film from the original trilogy and to the Dark Phoenix stories that have been used in the comics, but it's also highly being compared to, like I said, to Endgame, the most recent MCU film that we've received. Now, the MCU was supposed to close a chapter with Endgame and kind of set up for the next kind of story to be in line with the next phase of the MCU. However, really and truly, it did such a good job of closing that story that you could walk away from the MCU being very content with where it was left and then come back to it sometime later and retell the story. On the other hand, though, the Dark Phoenix much more was closing a chapter that we are left without the rest of the book. This is a kind of a moment here where the story really didn't get written fast enough for the film franchise, which is not the case. We've seen this story a few times in the comics, and so the information's all there. But we are just kind of left now sitting waiting for the next chapter that will never come. And so I think this and being compared so heavily to other films who have kind of done this resolution so well recently is really what the big problem here is, though. But I would love to know what you think. Have you seen the film? What did you think? What was your favorite parts? What was your least favorite parts? Let me know all that down in the comments below. Now, I will kind of be doing some follow-up kind of videos here. Like I said, there's a lot of things that were not explained very well, and so we'll probably go back in and do some kind of detailed breakdowns for all of you so you kind of have a better idea of what those references were. So to make sure you get those, click subscribe and set those alerts so you are notified when all those go live. Until then, though, I love you all 3,000, and I hope you have a marvelous rest of your day. Bye, friend.